This is a CBC podcast. Enter the world of Jonathan Goldstein. Season 8 of Wiretap is now available for purchase on iTunes. Relive this past season's funny, sad, wistful, and slightly strange telephone conversations with Jonathan's friends and family. Get it now at cbc.ca/iTunes.
Hello, I'm Matthew Lazenrider, and this is The Invisible Hand. This is a show about economics, the choices we make and the choices governments make about how to spend our money and time and effort. The invisible hand is the idea that when people pursue their own self-interest, they can make other people better off too. When the economy is slow and jobs are scarce, people often feel that self-interest would be served best if they save their money. But something strange can happen when everyone saves money all at the same time. Today on The Invisible Hand, the Paradox of Thrift. Life sure has been different for the world since the 2008 financial collapse, huh? There's not quite so much wealth floating around. Countries around the world are slashing budgets, and living more simply is in vogue. But there's a significant chunk of economic thought that says, forget austere monastic morals, the problem is not enough devilish demand. And furthermore, that if we all keep saving our money, we wind up losing money. We'll tell you more about this idea and the man who made it economically famous as the show continues. But first, as we contemplate global headlines about double-dip recessions, austerity, and declining growth, we're going to start with a look back. One great fear floating around out there today is that the continued economic turmoil in the world could lead to a second Great Depression. So let's go back to those awful, awful days.
During the past months, all Canada has sympathized deeply with the plight of the farmers in the drought areas, both here and in the United States.
In 1929, the stock market crashed. In 1930, a severe drought. The financial collapse was bad enough, but without rain, unemployment grew instead of crops. And because everything is connected, it wasn't just the farm workers and capitalists who suffered, but everyone in between. Let's meet one of those people.
Hello, I'm Nadine Jones.
Nadine was born in the early 20th century.
150 years ago, 1923.
So she was 6 when the market collapsed and 7 when the drought hit. And what does she remember most about her childhood?
Poverty more than anything. You know, everything was done without money, and if you needed money to do anything, you had to earn it, like for picking blackberries and selling them at 2 cents a box, or throwing in cords of wood for 25 cents. And we moved to a little house, 2 bedrooms, I think, on 20th Avenue in North Van, which was $20 a month. What I recall most about living there was that every day without fail there would be 1 or 2 or maybe even more threadbare looking men asking to do any kind of a job, mend fences or roofs or dig gardens or anything for a meal. They didn't even want money, they were hungry.
In Nadine's story, people didn't just have to cut back on consumption, they didn't consume at all. In order to be a consumer, you need to have something to spend. And hardly anyone had anything to spend.
Mom used to send me to the butcher for dog bones, and I was always so embarrassed because we didn't have a dog. And she used to make stew out of the dog bones, which were free. But everybody was in the same boat, you know. When we had holes in our shoes, we cut out cardboard insoles, and everybody else was doing it. So when they got wet and eased out through the hole, and which was very embarrassing for teenagers, other people's shoes were doing the same thing.
So you didn't have money to buy a new pair of shoes, so you fixed them with cardboard. Well, great, right? Maybe that's what the world needs right now. Some people say it was unchecked consumerism that got us into this global economic mess in the first place. So what if we cut back? Maybe practice a little austerity in our own lives, fix our own shoes, bottle our own preserves, sew our own elbow patches. What could possibly be wrong with a little thrift right now? Well, back in the days of the Great Depression, one man saw a real problem with thrift. a British economist named John Maynard Keynes. He was working in the early 20th century and inspired a whole school of economists. He advocated using government spending to basically make up jobs for people, the kind of bridge-building, highway-paving projects that now we'd call stimulus programs. The followers of the theories of Mr. Keynes are referred to as Keynesians. Here's one now.
Hello, I'm Robert Shiller, professor of economics at Yale University.
And in case you've ever heard someone say that economists aren't good for anything because they didn't see the housing collapse coming, check this out. Shiller wrote in the year 2000 that he was worried about a, quote, housing bubble. In the Wall Street Journal in 2006, he wrote, "There is significant risk of a very bad period, with slow sales, falling prices, rising default and foreclosures, serious trouble in financial markets, and a possible recession." We all know what happened next. But back to the Great Depression.
The Depression is highly relevant because that's where we would be, I believe, if we hadn't already done this stimulus after the 2008 crisis. The G20 nations got together and they agreed on coordinated stimulus. And so we didn't go into it. We looked like we were heading for it. We were seeing a collapsing house of cards. Not so much in Canada, but Canada would have been affected anyway if the rest of the world goes down. So the politicians did the right thing then.
So after the 2008 crisis, the G20 nations agreed on a kind of coordinated approach to work toward economic recovery. Now, before we go any further, a word of warning. Perhaps more than any other topic discussed in this series, there is great debate among economists on how the world got into the mess of the Depression and how the world got out of it, not to mention how we can apply any of the lessons learned to what's happening today. John Maynard Keynes was celebrated in his time, and his ideas held sway right up until the 80s, when a fresh new free market perspective took hold and Keynes fell out of favor. But after the crash of 2008, Keynes was suddenly back in style. Remember all those green and blue economic action plan signs that popped up across Canada? They pointed out all of the places that the government was supporting a stimulus program with work on shovel-ready infrastructure projects. All of those signs were like monuments to Keynes himself. But, as we all know, that coordinated global effort of the G20 countries isn't the end of the story. You heard Robert Shiller say that Canada has done better than many countries in terms of recovering from the 2008 recession. But around the world, things are still tough. Economies are still in trouble. The unemployment rate in some major European economies, like Spain, is pushing 25%. Greece is in terrible financial straits. The United States is still waiting for serious employment growth. So something didn't quite go as John Maynard Keynes would have liked if he'd been around, supervising those recovery efforts. Coming up, we'll learn what a 300-year-old poem about a hive of bees can tell us about today's economy. I'm Matthew Lazenrider, and you're listening to The Invisible Hand on CBC Radio 1 and Sirius 159. Today, the paradox of thrift, how, if everyone does the right thing at the same time, it can turn out very wrong. You can follow us on Twitter at CBC The Hand. John Maynard Keynes was working in the early 20th century. But for inspiration, he turned to a piece of poetry from the 18th century by a guy named Bernard Mandeville. His poem, called The Fable of the Bees, was published in England in 1705, and it caused some serious controversy. It was about a prosperous, rich, hard-working, but corrupt beehive. For a dramatic reading, we've brought in Christopher Gaze, eloquent actor and artistic director of Vancouver's Bard on the Beach Shakespeare Festival. Behold, The Fable of the Bees.
A spacious hive with well-stocked bees that lived in luxury and ease was counted the great nursery of sciences and industry. Vast numbers thronged the fruitful hive, yet those vast numbers made 'em thrive, millions endeavoring to supply each other's lust and vanity. All trades and places knew some cheat. No calling was without deceit.
So you've got this hive, right, where all the bees are happy and wealthy, even the ones toiling away with shovel and pick. But they're all kind of jerks. They backstab each other, lie, cheat, and steal to get ahead. But altogether, all of that sin lets them live lavishly, over the top, with plenty of base comforts like wine and beer and rich food. And one day, the rich but immoral bees decide it's time to go the straight and narrow. And one bee makes it so.
But all the rogues cried brazenly, "Good gods, had we but honesty!" But Jove, with indignation, moved at last in anger swore, he'd rid the bawling hive of fraud, and did.
So Job the bee kicks the most extravagant bees out of the hive and denounces gluttony. And all the bees decide they won't be so lavish anymore. They think that will make the hive better off, but something unexpected happens. We'll find out exactly what a little later. But first, you might be wondering what in the world this has to do with global economics. Well, Robert Shiller from Yale explains it like this. The lavish living of the beehive and all of their naughty business is kind of like government spending in hard times. It feels like stuff you don't need. It's like extra stuff, over the top. Shiller sees the corruption of the beehive as a parallel for the public's perception of big spending governments.
What that represents is the public antipathy toward stimulus is that it isn't quite up and up. It's just an instinct to think that in bad times we have to get sober, we have to roll up our sleeves and be willing to suffer. And we don't play cards, we don't drink beer, all those things go out because we're in tough times, right? That's the instinct.
So this economist says that stimulus can sometimes be seen as an excessive luxury. If that's true, then cutting back, living humbly and modestly, seems like the moral thing to do. And Shiller believes that after all of that stimulus in 2008, politicians around the world picked up this vibe from their electorate and worried that voters would see stimulus spending as too much spending, just like the bees in Mandeville's poem.
Mandeville is relevant. We should read him again because it's about the overwhelming public perception that you've got to suffer to get out. You've got to pull back and become a Puritan for a while.
Just like stimulus was all the rage after the crash, austerity is in vogue. You hear about it in the news, governments pulling back all over the world. The United Kingdom, Greece, Ireland, the United States, cutting programs, cutting spending, laying off public sector workers. UK Prime Minister David Cameron called his recent budget sober. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has spent the past few years arguing for prudence. Even here in Canada, where the economy is much less dire than in other places, Finance Minister Jim Flaherty described his last budget as frugal. So to economists like Robert Shiller, politicians choose austerity, frugality, and prudence because continuous stimulus appears to be opulent, lavish, profligate. Like that wealthy but gluttonous hive of bees. But wait a second. What happened to those bees anyway? In the poem, they were really wealthy and all living large, drinking and carrying on and having a great time. All of a sudden, they decided to live more modestly. What happened after they changed their ways? After the bees cast out the worst offenders, the ones living the largest off of profligate spending? Let's go back to Christopher Gay's and Bernard Mandeville's Fable of the Bees.
Now mind the glorious hive, and see how honesty and trade agree. For 'twas not only that they went, by whom vast sums were yearly spent, but multitudes that lived on them were daily forced to do the same. Those that remained, grown temperate, strive, not how to spend, but how to live. And when they paid their tavern score, resolved to enter it no more.
All the bees are out of work and have no money. The lawyer bees aren't rich anymore. The builder bees are broke. No money to pay the tavern bee. And the moral of this 18th century story? The bees lost everything but their honesty. They lived in an empty, hollow hive, free of luxury, with only their prudence to comfort them. So what do Keynesians like Robert Shiller think the world, especially Europe and the United States, can learn from the hive and apply to today? We'll find out in just a moment. You are listening to The Invisible Hand on CBC Radio 1 and Sirius 159. Today, John Maynard Keynes, the Paradox of Thrift, and the world's obsession with austerity. Don't be frugal with your emails. Send us some feedback at invisiblehand@cbc.ca. So far, with the help of an old poem about a hive of bees, we've learned that sometimes the idea of cutting back and living simply seems more honest in a way. But the beehive metaphor ends horribly for the bees. They're honest and austere, but poor and ruined. Beehive metaphors aren't that popular with politicians anyway. But here's one that is: the family next door. When politicians call for austerity or cuts or reductions, they often paint a picture of the simple family going through hard times. They love talking about austerity like the government is Ma and Pa and little Jimmy and Molly, not splurging on the extras, but living within their means.
It's no secret that government has gotten too big in size and scope in order to work effectively. So what if it were run more like your household?
Everybody in the province has to look after their own budget. They know that if we spend more than we can afford, we're going to be piling mountains of debt on our kids, or we're going to have to raise taxes.
If you ran your household like Washington, you would be in big trouble.
Washington will be tightening its belt just like families are having to tighten their belts. We're going to have to put off spending on things we don't need.
That's a collection of broadcasters, as well as U.S. President Barack Obama and B.C. Premier Christy Clark, discussing national and provincial governments as if they were family households. But many economists would tell you, governments are not families. Families don't typically borrow money from each other. They don't pay each other for their work. It's a whole different thing. Yale professor and Keynes-inspired economist Robert Shiller has a different metaphor: the farm in winter.
Well, every farm has the same circumstance. There's no crops to plant in the winter. So there's nothing to do for weeding, sowing, the usual tasks associated with farming. But I don't think they have unemployment. People get up in the morning and they want to do something, and that's a natural impulse. So they fix the barn, they dig a well, they build a fence, or they fix a crumbling wall, something like that. And they find something to do. That's what we have to do at a time like this. This is a sort of economic winter. And it's just such a tragedy that we have so many people unemployed just doing nothing. It's a tragedy that builds through time, because as years go by and some people stay unemployed for many years, they lose their skills, they lose their sense of self-respect, they drop out, and that's what's happening. So we have to mimic the farm in winter.
So to Shiller, all of this austerity is like the owner of the farm telling people to stay inside the farmhouse. Don't go out and mend the fence, don't paint the barn, don't dig a well, just ride it out, and hopefully the sun will come back one day. But sometimes the sun takes a long, long time to come out.
The season works like clockwork, and we can't do very much about that. But the economy, or the slump that follows a recession, can go on for 10 years too. That's called the Great Depression.
So economists like Robert Shiller will tell you that part of the problem in the Depression was that no one was spending anything. No one was buying new shoes or new cars. People were working just to eat. They had no income, nothing to save up. But it wasn't like everyone had all of their money in stocks before the great crash of 1929. So where did all the money go? Well, there's a little something out there called the Paradox of Thrift, popularized by John Maynard Keynes. It's the idea that when everyone saves money at the same time, everyone loses money, and their savings slowly evaporate. Keynesians often look to a real-life story, for once not a metaphor, to explain this strange phenomenon. To get your head around the paradox of thrift, it helps to think about babysitting. Just ask this guy.
My name is Dick Sweeney. I'm a professor of international finance at Georgetown University, and one of my claims to fame is that I was once a member of the Capitol Hill Babysitting Co-op.
That might not sound like much of a claim to fame, but when Dick and his wife Joan joined that co-op in the 70s, they walked into the pages of economic history. We'll get to that in a moment, but first, Dick Sweeney explains how the co-op worked.
It was great. It was a way to get people to come over and babysit for your children when you went out and did some of the fun things you can do in Washington, and you paid for it by babysitting for other people's children. For every hour we babysat, at the end, the people whose kids we babysat for would give us 2 pieces of scrip per hour.
Scrip was the currency of the co-op, cardboard tokens that worked like cash, and scrip was at the heart of an economic crisis in the co-op.
Oh, it got itself into a recession. They had it set up so over time, the number of units of scrip outstanding per head was actually falling. And so instead of having a little bowl on your mantle full of scrip, you had a little bowl on your mantle that didn't have very many scrip. So you saved up those scrip for when you really were going to need them. Everyone wanted to babysit because they felt like they didn't have enough scrip there. But no one wanted to go out because they realized that spending the scrip was really, really precious. How were they going to get more of it?
In economic terms, there was a huge lack of aggregate demand. That's the combined demand across an economy. People were willing to supply babysitting time, but no one wanted to buy babysitting time. The resulting babysitting recession became a source of economic fascination for the Sweeneys. They wrote an article called Monetary Theory and the Great Capitol Hill Babysitting Co-op Crisis. It appeared in the Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking in 1978. And how did all of this affect the Sweeneys' children?
Like a lot of things with kids, they didn't sort of notice the great economic and constitutional crises going on around them.
The Sweeney kids might not have realized it, but the co-op and the article their parents wrote about it have been discussed, debated, and cited by economists ever since. Just think about the Capitol Hill babysitting recession like a whole economy. In an economy, saving is what people do when they want to put today's money aside to use tomorrow. But people can only save money if they have money coming in, an income. People can only get income when someone else is spending money. So as people across the system save, all at the same time, incomes get smaller and smaller. And here's where the idea of the paradox of thrift comes in. When incomes drop, people have to dip into their savings just to get by. A Keynesian economist would say, all of that saving ultimately results in savings being eaten away. Once again, here's Yale economist Robert Shiller.
When people try to make themselves whole in a bad economic situation, it only gets worse. All of their efforts have exactly the opposite implication than they hoped for. So you try to save more, but you don't save more, because in this process of trying, your income goes down. And even though you cut your expenditure, your income can go down even more. And that's the paradox of thrift.
And Shiller's fear is that government austerity won't just prolong economic uncertainty, but because of the paradox of thrift, may make people worse off than they are now. If savings get smaller and smaller, one day they'll be gone. And remember the strange case of the profligate bees who were just trying to become more prudent and sober, but ended up poor and upset? Well, they suffered from the paradox of thrift as well. No one was spending on luxuries, so aggregate demand fell, and suddenly none of the bees had any jobs, any income, any savings. So to Robert Shiller and many Keynesians, the answer is clear. If monetary policy doesn't get people spending, taking advantage of low interest rates and easy money, that's when it's time to end the religious devotion to austerity. They'd say, enough with the sobriety, the prudence, the frugality. The time for austerity was when we were rolling in dough, not now when you need people out having a good time. Here's Robert Shiller again.
The right time would have been 2005, 2006, or 1997, 1998. Oh, these were rapid economic growth times, and that's when you pay down the debt.
And to Shiller, if you're basically printing money and lowering interest rates and people still aren't spending anything, the government should do the spending instead. The queen bee should run a deficit, hire some worker bees, pay them to fix up the place. Once they've got enough money, they'll start going to the tavern again, and the tavern bee will have an income. Soon he'll have enough money to hire some of the worker bees to be bartenders, and the queen bee doesn't have to pay them anymore. Once all of the bees are drinking and dancing and living large once again, tax receipts to the queen bee will skyrocket, and she can pay off the debt. But Shiller acknowledges politicians just don't see it the Keynesian beehive way. They'd rather pull back and let the bees find something else to do.
It seems pretty obvious to me that we shouldn't be letting this happen. It's an ongoing tragedy. When people are unemployed for a long time, it's partly irreversible, and the damage, the psychic damage, is not going to go away. And it's an issue of self-respect, of feeling part of society. It seems obvious to me that we should find things for people to do, and yet we're not. Our willingness to get up and do things fluctuates through time, and sometimes we just get discouraged, and especially when you're discouraged by the economy. Years go by and no improvement, and you think my skills aren't worth anything, and sometimes people get into a funk, and it seems to infect the whole economy. So if you did some kind of stimulus spending on a great scale, it would come out like a ray of sunshine, and it would change not only the pocketbooks of people, but it would change their real underlying mood, and that would ultimately be the real stimulus for the economy.
So governments around the world threw a Keynesian summer beach party after the 2008 financial collapse. We were all frolicking in the warm sun of stimulus programs and projects, but to some economists, the end came too soon. The cold weather of austerity swept in, dampening spirits and darkening moods. And those like Robert Shiller are left to hope that the cold breeze of austerity doesn't lead to a long economic winter. If it does, it won't just be the Eurozone affected or the United States. We're used to the cold in Canada, but we aren't insulated from chilly economic winds when they're blowing from every direction. And that's The Invisible Hand for this week. Check out our website at cbc.ca/The Invisible Hand. Our show is produced by Jeff Turner, our economic consultant is Stephen Gordon, and our senior producer is Karen Burgess. I'm Matthew Lazen-Ryder.
Looking for more CBC podcasts? Go to cbc.ca/podcasting.